My aunt tossed my late grandmother's cracked phone into a garbage bag like it was a moldy piece of fruit. I pulled it out. That night I plugged it into a charger. Sitting on the home screen was a single voice memo, 47 minutes long. It contained every name, every date, and every stolen dollar. I played it at the will reading without saying a word. What happened next destroyed a 30-year legacy in under 5 minutes. I am Chloe. I am 32 years old. Before I tell you how a broken piece of technology dismantled my entire family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were blind to their greed. The air in my grandmother Beatrice's apartment smelled like industrial bleach and stale lavender. She had been dead for barely 48 hours. My Aunt Vivian did not believe in wasting time. She paced through the living room wearing a silk scarf and heels, tossing 50 years of memories into black contractor bags. I stood by the doorway holding a cardboard box of photo albums I had managed to salvage. Vivian swept a pile of mail off the mahogany side table. A silver iPhone clattered onto the hardwood floor. Vivian kicked it toward the open trash bag. I dropped my box and reached into the plastic bag, pulling the device out. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks. Vivian grabbed my wrist. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Drop it, Chloe. That is trash from a senile old woman." She did not even know how to unlock it toward the end. I looked at her grip on my arm. Then I looked at her face. Her jaw was tight. Her pupils were dilated. As a federal compliance auditor, I spend 50 hours a week hunting for anomalies in financial records. I track people who hide things for a living. I know what panic looks like. Vivian was not throwing away garbage. She was destroying evidence. I pulled my arm free and slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. If it is garbage, I will dispose of it myself. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder. My Uncle Richard walked in from the kitchen. He wore a tailored suit that stretched too tight across his stomach. He made his living flipping foreclosed properties and bullying desperate homeowners. He tried to use the same tactic on me. "Put the phone back on the table, Chloe." Richard stepped into my space, using his height to block the hallway. "You have no right to take property from this estate. Give it back right now, or I will have the building security throw you out onto the street." I did not step back. I looked at the sweat forming on his upper lip. They were terrified of a device that supposedly belonged to a woman who could not remember her own name. That fear confirmed everything I suspected. I zipped my jacket. "Call security, Richard. Let us explain to them why you are physically detaining me over a broken piece of electronics." He clenched his jaw, but did not move to stop me as I sidestepped him and walked out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. I did not look back. I walked straight to my car, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I pulled a charging cable from my center console and plugged the phone in. 10 minutes passed. A white Apple logo appeared on the cracked glass. Then the lock screen illuminated the dark interior of my car. A warning message sat squarely in the center of the display. "Enter passcode. 3 attempts remaining before all data is permanently erased." I stared at the glowing screen illuminating the dark interior of my car. 3 attempts remaining. Vivian and Richard probably tried my grandmother Beatrice's birthday. They likely tried the street address of her apartment. They never paid attention to the things that actually mattered to the woman they claimed to love. My grandfather died on October 14, 1998. After his funeral, Vivian complained about the catering costs, while Richard asked about the life insurance payout before the casket was even lowered into the ground. Beatrice never forgave them for that. She grieved in quiet dignity for over 2 decades, keeping that date sacred. I typed 101498. The screen shifted. The numeric keypad dissolved into a minimalist home screen. I exhaled a breath I did not realize I was holding in my lungs. The interface was sparse. No social media applications, no games. My grandmother used this device strictly for communication, but a stark red notification badge hovered over the voice memo's icon. I tapped it. There was only one file saved in the directory. The title was simply my name, Chloe. The duration read 47 minutes and 12 seconds. I locked my car doors again, making certain the concrete parking garage remained empty around me. I connected the phone to my car audio system to ensure I would not miss a single syllable. I pressed play. For the first 5 seconds, there was only the sound of shallow breathing and the distant muffled hum of a television broadcast. Then her voice broke the silence. It was not the fragile, trembling whisper that Vivian had paraded in front of doctors and neighbors. For the past 2 years, my aunt had orchestrated a masterclass in medical deception. She dragged Beatrice to various specialists, whispering false concerns about memory lapses and wandering thoughts, successfully painting a tragic picture of severe dementia. That narrative gave Vivian the perfect excuse to seize control of the daily finances. But the voice echoing through my car speakers was lethal. It was lucid. It was the voice of a woman who knew exactly what was happening in the shadows of her own home. "Hello, Chloe. If you are listening to this, Vivian finally succeeded in shutting me up." Her tone was steady-paced with the precision of a judge delivering a final verdict. "They think I do not know about the bitter powder mixed into my evening tea. They think the drowsiness makes me blind to their actions. But I stopped drinking her tea 3 months ago. I spit the capsules into the napkin on my lap and poured the cup into the potted ferns when she turned her back." The recording paused, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the cold air of my vehicle. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Vivian was sedating her. I felt a surge of pure fury burning in my chest, but my professional instincts forced me to focus entirely on the audio. Beatrice took a slow, rattling breath and continued. "I know you chose your career because you despise thieves, so I gathered the math for you. Listen carefully. What followed was a terrifying display of financial tracking. My grandmother, supposedly losing her mind to age, read out bank routing numbers from pure memory. She listed exact dates and exact withdrawals. February 12th, $4,000 transferred to Richard LLC account under the guise of urgent plumbing repairs. No plumber ever stepped foot in this building. March 18th, Vivian withdrew $12,000 from my secondary retirement fund. She claimed it was to hire an in-home nursing service. I have not seen a nurse since January. Beatrice listed transaction after transaction. It was a verbal ledger of systematic elder abuse. As a compliance auditor, my mind automatically mapped the data points. The pattern was textbook fraud. They were bleeding her dry through 1,000 small, carefully calculated cuts, keeping the amounts just under the threshold that might trigger an automatic bank investigation. The recording reached the 30-minute mark. Her voice grew tighter, strained with suppressed anger. But the small thefts were not enough to satisfy them, Chloe. Richard got greedy. He needed massive capital for that commercial strip mall project the local bank refused to finance. Last Tuesday, I found a letter from the county recorder office mixed in with the promotional junk mail. Richard forged my signature on a power of attorney document. He used that fraudulent paperwork to take out a reverse mortgage on this apartment. $300,000 secured against the property your grandfather bought with his own sweat. He stole the roof over my head while smiling at my dinner table. Before my brain could fully process the reality of Richard committing felony mortgage fraud, a harsh ringing pierced the quiet of my car. My personal cell phone was vibrating violently inside the cup holder. The caller ID displayed Marcus. I paused the voice memo. Marcus is my brother-in-law, married to my older sister, who sensibly moved across the country years ago to avoid our poisonous relatives. He is 36 African American and holds a senior cybersecurity role at a major global technology firm. We share a mutual understanding that Vivian and Richard are opportunistic parasites. He rarely calls me this late unless a server is actively burning down. I swiped the screen to answer. Chloe, tell me you are not trying to wire transfer your entire savings to an overseas account right now, Marcus said. His voice lacked his usual easygoing warmth. It was clipped urgent and strictly professional. I frowned, glancing at my dark dashboard. What are you talking about? I'm sitting in my car in a parking garage. I am not even logged into my banking application. Marcus cursed sharply under his breath. I could hear the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard through the speaker. Someone is attempting to brute force their way into your primary checking account. They initiated a password reset protocol 5 minutes ago and managed to intercept the secondary authentication prompt. I set up those custom firewall alerts for you last year, and my secondary monitors are currently flashing red. Cold dread washed over my skin. Someone is trying to drain my money. Not just drain it, Marcus corrected the typing growing faster. They are trying to lock you out entirely. They are systematically altering the recovery email address and the security questions. If they succeed, your funds will be frozen indefinitely, and the bank fraud department will flag your profile for suspicious activity. You will not be able to pay for a lawyer, a flight, or even a tank of gas." I stared at the cracked iPhone resting in my lap. The timing was too deliberate. Vivian and Richard knew I had walked out with the device. They knew I was an auditor who could find their paper trail. They realized they could not physically wrestle the phone away from me without causing a scene, so they were executing a digital strike to cripple my resources before the funeral tomorrow. "Where is the access request coming from?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Can you trace the IP address?" More typing echoed over the line. "They are using a cheap commercial virtual private network to mask the location," Marcus explained. "But it is sloppy work. They left a back door open in the routing protocol. Give me 10 seconds to bounce the signal back to its origin." I waited, listening to the heavy thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Got them. The origin node is an internet service provider registered to a residential address in the northern suburbs. It is your Aunt Vivian house. Richard must be using her home network to run the hacking script. They were trying to silence me. Without access to capital, I could not retain legal counsel to challenge the estate. If my personal accounts were flagged for suspicious offshore activity, Richard could easily point to me as an unstable, financially irresponsible niece, undermining any claims I made about their own fraudulent behavior. It was a preemptive character assassination designed to destroy my credibility before I could speak a single word. "Block them, Marcus," I instructed, my tone devoid of panic. "Shut down all external access to my financial accounts. Reroute the security keys to your secure server. Lock it down so tight that even I have to call you directly to buy a cup of coffee." Marcus did not hesitate. "Done. The defensive firewall is active. They are hitting a digital brick wall right now. Are you okay, Chloe? What exactly did you find in that apartment?" I looked back at the paused 47-minute voice memo displayed on my dashboard screen. "I found the rope they are going to use to hang themselves," I replied. "But they know I am coming for them. The funeral is tomorrow morning, and they are already trying to cut my legs out from under me." Marcus sighed heavily, the sound of his keyboard finally ceasing. "Keep your head on a swivel. I am booking the first flight out of Seattle tonight. I will be standing next to you before the sun comes up." I thanked him and ended the call. The glow of the screen cast long, sharp shadows across the steering wheel. Vivian and Richard thought they could bankrupt me and bury the truth along with Beatrice. They thought their crude intimidation tactics would force me to retreat. They were wrong. Tomorrow at the cemetery, I was not going to mourn quietly in the background. I was going to war. The damp morning air hung over Oakwood Cemetery, chilling the manicured lawns where my family gathered. Marcus stood at my right side, his presence an immovable pillar against the hostility radiating from the other side of the burial plot. He had taken the red-eye flight from Seattle, arriving at my apartment just before dawn. We did not discuss the failed cyber attack on the drive over. We did not need to. The battle lines were already drawn in the soil. Vivian and Richard wasted no time orchestrating their social quarantine. Before the priest even opened his prayer book, my aunt and uncle positioned themselves as the grieving gatekeepers. They intercepted every arriving cousin, every distant relative, and every family friend. Vivian dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, whispering frantic, hushed stories into their ears. I watched the extended family shoot sideways glances in my direction. Their expressions shifted from mourning to suspicion. Vivian was spreading the narrative that I was financially unstable, that I had tried to ransack Beatrice's apartment the day before, and that my sudden interest in the funeral was driven purely by greed. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me to look like the outcast facing a united front. I kept my posture straight, fixing my gaze on the polished mahogany casket. I would not give them the satisfaction of looking defensive. The priest concluded his final blessing. He stepped back from the grave and gestured toward the mourners, inviting anyone who wished to share a memory of Beatrice to come forward. I adjusted my black coat and stepped into the narrow walkway between the folding chairs. I had prepared a eulogy. I intended to speak about my grandmother tending to her rooftop garden, about her fierce independence, and about the quiet dignity she maintained until her final days. I did not make it past the second row. Sterling stepped directly into my path. Vivian's son was 28 years old, wearing a flashy maroon suit that looked entirely inappropriate for a funeral. I knew his meager salary as a freelance consultant could never cover the cost of the designer fabric. He was wearing the stolen money his mother had funneled into his accounts. He leaned into my personal space, deliberately knocking his shoulder hard against mine. The impact jarred my ribs, forcing me to stumble half a step backward. "Sit back down, Chloe," Sterling sneered, keeping his voice just low enough that the priest could not hear. "You do not have the floor. Nobody here wants to listen to a vulture trying to steal from a dead woman." His breath smelled heavily of expensive mints and stale alcohol. He squared his shoulders, attempting to physically block the aisle, puffing his chest out in a crude display of dominance. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to yell or push back so he could point to me as the instigator, proving his mother's stories right. Before I could form a response, the air shifted. Marcus stepped forward. My brother-in-law did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, calculated grace of a man who knows exactly how to neutralize a threat. Standing several inches taller and significantly broader than my cousin Marcus, eclipsed the morning light. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Marcus extended one large hand and placed it flat against the center of Sterling's chest. He pushed, applying a steady, undeniable pressure that forced the younger man to stagger backward on the wet grass. Sterling's eyes went wide with sudden panic. He swatted at Marcus' wrist, but Marcus simply caught his wrist mid-air, clamping his fingers down like a steel vise. "Take a step back," Marcus instructed. The temperature of his voice was freezing. It carried the absolute authority of someone who deals with global security breaches for a living. "Do not attempt to touch my sister-in-law again." Sterling tried to wrench his arm free, his face flushing dark red. "Hey, back off, man. This is a family matter." "You just made it my matter," Marcus replied, his grip tightening until Sterling winced. "You are causing a scene at your grandmother's funeral. Walk away, now." Marcus released the wrist and brushed his hands together, staring Sterling down without blinking. Sterling looked past Marcus, searching the crowd for Richard or Vivian to back him up. But Richard was watching the exchange with cautious apprehension, unwilling to engage physically with a man twice his size. "Left without reinforcements." Sterling muttered an insult under his breath, shoved his hands into his pockets and retreated to the back of the gathering. The physical threat was handled, but the real ambush was waiting in the shadows of the cemetery trees. As the awkward silence settled over the mourners, a man detached himself from the perimeter of the crowd and glided toward us. Julian Pierce wore a pristine charcoal pinstripe suit and carried a slim leather portfolio. He was the managing partner of a boutique estate planning firm downtown, and he moved with the oily smoothness of a salesman closing a questionable deal. Pierce stopped in front of me, offering a sympathetic smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Chloe, my deepest condolences," Pierce said, his tone dripping with rehearsed grief. "It is a tragedy to lose her, and such unfortunate tension today. Grief makes people act out of character. Please excuse Sterling." I stared at the lawyer, taking in his polished shoes and his expensive watch. "Thank you, Julian. The tension is certainly revealing." Pierce cleared his throat, adjusting his portfolio. "Yes, well, considering the friction within the family, Richard and Vivian have agreed that lingering on legal matters will only exacerbate the pain. We need to prioritize closure. Therefore, I am expediting the reading of the estate documents." I raised an eyebrow. "Expediting the funeral is not even over." Pierce nodded smoothly. "I have scheduled the official will reading for 3:00 this afternoon at my office. I expect all named beneficiaries to be present. We will handle the disclosures, sign the necessary waivers, and finalize the probate timeline immediately." My analytical mind kicked into overdrive. The gears of his legal trap were grinding right in front of me. Rushing a will reading mere hours after putting a body in the ground was highly irregular. Standard probate procedure dictates waiting periods, formal notifications, and a methodical inventory of assets. You do not rush beneficiaries into a boardroom unless you are terrified of what they might discover given enough time. The strategy was brutally transparent. Pierce and Richard wanted to blitz the family. They intended to present a predetermined set of documents, pressure the grieving relatives into signing liability waivers, and legally bind the estate distribution before the banks opened on Monday morning. Once those waivers were signed, any future attempts to audit the accounts or challenge the will would be tied up in years of expensive uphill litigation. They were trying to lock the vault while I was still reeling from the cyber attack on my bank accounts. They thought I was crippled. They thought I was defenseless. Julian, 3 o'clock seems quite rushed, Marcus noted, stepping up beside me. Usually families are given a few days to process. Pierce offered a dismissive wave. As the executor legal counsel, I have the authority to set the schedule. It is best for everyone to rip the bandage off quickly. I will see you both at 3. The lawyer turned on his heel and walked back toward Richard, giving my uncle a subtle, confirming nod. The snare was set. They expected me to walk into that boardroom panicked, empty-handed, and desperate to fight a legal battle I had no funds to support. I did not panic. I felt a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingertips traced the shattered glass of the old iPhone, resting safely against the lining. They had laid out their perfect legal ambush, completely unaware that I was walking into their office carrying a 47-minute explosive device. "We will be there," I said quietly, watching Pierce and Richard shake hands, "and we will bring closure." The conference room at Pierce & Associates occupied the 14th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise designed entirely to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a sweeping view of the Seattle skyline, while the interior was dominated by a massive slab of polished marble functioning as a meeting table. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the temperature deliberately cold. Marcus and I arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. We took the 2 empty leather chairs positioned at the far end of the marble table, intentionally placing maximum physical distance between ourselves and the rest of the room. Vivian and Richard were already seated across from Julian Pierce. They did not look like grieving children who had buried their mother 5 hours ago. They looked like investors waiting for a corporate merger to finalize. Vivian wore her oversized designer sunglasses perched atop her head, scrolling casually through her phone. Richard sat with his legs crossed, drumming his fingers against the armrest in a display of eager impatience. Sterling lounged next to his mother, sipping sparkling water and smirking whenever his gaze landed on me. They possessed the supreme toxic confidence of people who believed they had already won the war. Pierce entered the room carrying a thick manila folder. He smoothed his tie, took his place at the head of the table, and arranged his documents with performative solemnity. "Thank you all for being prompt," Pierce began, his voice echoing slightly in the vast empty space. "We are here to execute the final wishes of Beatrice Evelyn Hayes. As I explained at the cemetery, minimizing administrative delays is the most prudent path forward for the family." He unclasped the folder and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked paper bound by a blue legal spine. "I hold here the last will and testament of Beatrice Hayes, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized 3 months ago on August 12th, Pierce announced. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the room to ensure everyone was properly attentive. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cold marble. I knew Beatrice had visited a different attorney 5 years ago to establish a balanced trust. The document Pierce was holding was a newly minted weapon. I will dispense with the boilerplate legal phrasing and summarize the core distribution of assets. Pierce continued, flipping to the second page. First, regarding the primary residence, the penthouse apartment valued at $1.8 million. This property is bequeathed in its entirety to Richard Hayes, acknowledging his extensive efforts in managing the structural maintenance and property taxes during her declining health. Richard nodded solemnly, a masterclass in feigned humility. He had not fixed a single leaking faucet in that apartment in 10 years. Second, regarding the liquid assets investment portfolios and remaining retirement funds totaling roughly $1.2 million, Pierce read on. These accounts are transferred exclusively to Vivian Hayes. The testator specifically notes that this distribution reflects Vivian's selfless dedication to providing daily care, medical supervision, and emotional support during her final difficult years. Vivian reached out and squeezed Richard's hand, offering a sad, delicate smile to the empty room. Sterling let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. He leaned back in his chair, linking his hands behind his head, unable to contain his gloating. He looked directly at me, his eyes dancing with malicious triumph. And finally Pierce said, his tone flattening as he turned to the final page. Regarding Chloe Hayes, the testator includes a specific disinheritance clause. I quote, "I leave no financial provision for my granddaughter Chloe, as she has built an independent career and no longer requires my support. I wish her well, but my estate must provide for those who sacrifice their time to care for me. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. They had crafted a masterpiece of legal theft. The document was designed to look perfectly rational to a probate judge. It painted a picture of a grateful mother rewarding her devoted caregivers while politely cutting out the independent, distant granddaughter. It provided the exact narrative Richard and Vivian had been selling to the extended family for months. I looked at the blue spine of the document. It was a forgery of intent born from a poisoned cup of tea and a sedated mind. Therefore, Pierce concluded, closing the folder with a sharp snap. To expedite the probate process and avoid tying up the assets in unnecessary court reviews, I have prepared waivers of contest for all parties present. By signing these waivers today, you acknowledge the validity of this document and agree not to pursue any frivolous litigation. Once signed, I can begin releasing the funds to Richard and Vivian by Tuesday. He slid a stack of paper across the smooth marble, accompanied by a heavy gold pen. The document stopped right in front of my hands. "Sign the waiver," Chloe Richard demanded, dropping the act. His voice was hard, authoritative. "You heard the will. Your grandmother knew who actually put the work in. Do not drag this out and embarrass yourself in front of a judge. Just sign the paper and go back to your auditing spreadsheets." Vivian picked up her phone again, bored. "We really do not have time for a tantrum, Chloe. The matter is settled." I looked down at the gold pen. I did not touch it. I looked at Marcus. He gave me a single slow nod, his face an unreadable mask. I pushed the waiver back across the table. The paper slid silently over the marble, stopping just short of Pierce's portfolio. "I am not signing that," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the glass room, "because that document is garbage. It is a fraudulent instrument coerced from a woman who was being systematically drugged in her own home." The atmosphere shattered. Richard slammed both hands flat onto the marble table, the crack echoing like a gunshot. He shot up from his leather chair, his face instantly turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. "How dare you!" Richard roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. "You ungrateful little brat! You walk into this office after ignoring your grandmother for months and accuse us of crimes because you are bitter. You did not get a payout." Vivian stood up beside him, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "You are sick, Chloe. You are mentally unwell. Julian, call building security right now. I will not sit here and be defamed by a jealous lunatic." Sterling jumped to his feet, circling the table toward me, his fists clenched. "I told you this morning to back off. You want me to throw you out of this office myself." Marcus stood up slowly. The sheer size of him abruptly halted Sterling's advance. Marcus did not speak. He simply stepped between me and my advancing cousin, crossing his arms over his chest. Sterling swallowed hard and stopped dead in his tracks. Julian Pierce picked up the desk phone, his eyes narrowing with icy professionalism. "Chloe, I will not tolerate slander in my firm. You have 30 seconds to retract those baseless accusations and sign the waiver, or I am having you escorted out by armed security, and I will personally file a defamation suit against you on behalf of the estate." They were screaming. They were threatening. They were using their volume and their numbers to create a wall of intimidation, expecting me to crack under the overwhelming pressure of a unified attack. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue back. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the shattered iPhone. I placed it gently onto the marble table. While Richard continued yelling about calling the police, I tapped the screen. I swiped down to open the control center. The Bluetooth icon was pulsing. I scanned the available devices. The firm conference room was equipped with a high-end ceiling-mounted surround sound system. The network name Pierce Boardroom Audio appeared on the list. I tapped to connect. A soft chime echoed from the speakers above us, signaling the pairing was successful. "What are you doing?" Pierce demanded, the phone receiver still hovering near his ear. He looked confused by my sudden focus on the broken device. Richard stopped shouting, his eyes dropping to the phone on the table. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He remembered the garbage bag. He remembered the confrontation in the apartment. "Put that away!" Richard barked suddenly, looking less like an angry patriarch and more like a cornered animal. "Julian, get security up here now." I opened the Voice Memos application. The file titled, "Chloe Sat Ready." I did not offer an explanation. I did not trade insults. I simply pressed play. The premium surround sound system of the boardroom was designed for high-stakes corporate presentations. It amplified every syllable with pristine, terrifying clarity. My grandmother's voice dropped from the ceiling speakers, filling the vast space with a calm, deliberate resonance that seemed to vibrate against the glass walls. "Hello, Chloe. If you are listening to this, Vivian finally succeeded in shutting me up." The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. The air seemed to instantly vaporize. Richard froze mid-step. The desk phone slipped from Julian Pierce's hand, clattering noisily against the plastic cradle before falling to the carpet. "They think I do not know about the bitter powder mixed into my evening tea," Beatrice's voice continued echoing from every corner. "They think the drowsiness makes me blind to their actions, but I stopped drinking her tea 3 months ago. I spit the capsules into the napkin on my lap and poured the cup into the potted ferns when she turned her back." All color drained from Vivian's face. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch, who had spent the morning orchestrating a social quarantine at the cemetery, suddenly looked like a hollow, terrified shell. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She stared at the ceiling as if the ghost of her mother had physically materialized in the room. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then, the shock evaporated into explosive panic. "Turn it off!" Vivian shrieked. Her voice cracked a jagged sound of pure desperation. She lunged across the marble table, her hands scrambling frantically toward the shattered iPhone. She did not care about appearing dignified anymore. She moved with the frantic violence of an animal caught in a trap. She swiped her arm across the smooth stone, intending to sweep the device onto the floor and smash it under her designer heel. Marcus moved faster. His reflexes, honed by years of threat mitigation, were instantaneous. He did not grab Vivian. He simply snatched the phone off the table a fraction of a second before her manicured nails scraped the marble where it had just been resting. He lifted the device high above his head, holding it completely out of her reach. Vivian clawed at his chest, trying to climb over the table to get to his raised arm. "Give it to me! That is fake! She is lying!" Vivian screamed, her composure entirely destroyed. Marcus stepped back, bracing his core, remaining as immovable as a concrete pillar. "Sit down, Vivian," he commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that cut through her hysteria. "You lay hands on me again, and I will press assault charges before this meeting is over." Sterling rushed forward to help his mother, grabbing the edge of the table. "You cannot play that," he yelled, his face slick with nervous sweat. "That is illegal." The audio kept playing, indifferent to the chaos erupting beneath the speakers. Beatrice's voice remained steady, a spectral prosecutor delivering her case. "Listen carefully, Chloe. February 12th, $4,000 transferred to Richard LLC account under the guise of urgent plumbing repairs. March 18th, Vivian withdrew $12,000 from my secondary retirement fund." Richard staggered backward, clutching the back of his leather chair as if the floor had given way beneath him. The specific dates, the exact dollar amounts, the meticulously hidden transactions were being broadcast into the open air. The carefully constructed narrative of the devoted son and the exhausted caregiver was burning down in real time. But the small thefts were not enough to satisfy them. Beatrice continued, her tone tightening with lingering anger. Richard got greedy. He needed massive capital for that commercial strip mall project the local bank refused to finance. Last Tuesday, I found a letter from the county recorder office. Richard forged my signature on a power of attorney document. He used that fraudulent paperwork to take out a reverse mortgage on this apartment. $300,000 secured against the property your grandfather bought with his own sweat. Richard's chest heaved. He looked at Julian Pierce, his eyes wide with a frantic plea for an escape route. "Julian, do something. This is a fabrication." She used artificial intelligence to synthesize my mother voice. "You have to shut that off." I stood completely still, watching the destruction of their empire unfold. They were scrambling, grasping at ridiculous technological excuses to explain away the undeniable truth. But as I observed the room, my analytical focus shifted away from my hyperventilating aunt and uncle. I looked at Julian Pierce. The lawyer was not panicking. While Richard and Vivian were losing their minds, Pierce had calmly retrieved his desk phone from the floor. He placed it back on the cradle. He adjusted his tie, his face smoothing into a mask of icy professional detachment. He did not look surprised by the revelation of the forged power of attorney. He did not look shocked by the accusation of elder abuse. He looked annoyed. He knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow. A reverse mortgage on a premium real estate property requires extensive legal documentation, title searches, and notarized signatures. Richard could not have executed a $300,000 fraud without the active complicity of an estate attorney to rubber stamp the paperwork and smooth over the banking inquiries. Pierce was not just their lawyer, he was the architect of the theft. Pierce pressed a button on his console, cutting the power to the Bluetooth receiver. The boardroom speakers went dead mid-sentence. The sudden silence in the room rang in my ears. Vivian collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands, gasping for air. Richard wiped his forehead with his sleeve, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. Pierce folded his hands on the table, leaning forward. His demeanor was chillingly calm. "That was a very dramatic performance," Chloe Pierce said, his voice stripped of the faux sympathy he had displayed at the cemetery. "But it is legally worthless, and it is about to cost you your career." I narrowed my eyes. "Is that right, Julian?" "Absolutely," he replied, gesturing to the heavy blue folder containing the forged will. "Washington is a two-party consent state regarding audio recordings. You cannot legally record a private conversation or a voice memo intended to implicate others without their knowledge and consent. Presenting that audio in a legal setting is a violation of state wiretapping laws. It is inadmissible in any probate court." He leaned closer, his eyes cold and dead. "Furthermore, playing that unverified, illegally obtained audio in front of third parties constitutes defamation per se. You have just openly accused my clients, and by extension my firm, of felony fraud based on inadmissible evidence." He picked up the gold pen again, rolling it between his fingers. "I am going to draw up the paperwork right now. My firm is suing you for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and illegal wiretapping. We will freeze your assets, garnish your future wages, and I will personally ensure a formal complaint is filed with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners to strip you of your credentials." Richard let out a shaky breath, a cruel smile beginning to form on his lips as the lawyer provided their lifeline. "You hear that, Chloe? You played yourself. You are going to end up bankrupt and unemployed." Pierce pointed the gold pen directly at my chest. "Sign the waiver, surrender any claim to the estate, and hand over that phone so we can delete the illegal file. Do that, and I might convince your aunt and uncle not to destroy your life. Refuse, and I will have you served with a lawsuit before you reach the elevator." They thought the legal technicality had saved them. They thought the threat of a career-ending lawsuit would force me to submit and hand over the only copy of the evidence. They believed they held the ultimate trump card. I looked at Pierce. Then I looked at Marcus. Marcus did not hand over the phone. He pressed a button on the side of the device, unlocking the screen again. I turned my attention back to the arrogant lawyer sitting at the head of the table. "You are right, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Washington state wiretapping laws are very strict regarding admissibility." I stepped forward, resting my hands on the marble table, leaning in until I was mirroring his aggressive posture. "But you should really listen to the rest of the recording before you threaten me with a lawsuit." I nodded to Marcus. He tapped the screen. The audio did not play through the ceiling speakers this time. It played directly from the phone in Marcus' hand, the tinny speaker cutting through the quiet room. And the next sentence out of Beatrice's mouth was not about Richard or Vivian. It was about the man sitting across from me. Marcus held the phone out, aiming the speaker directly at the head of the marble table. He tapped the timeline, skipping past the silence that had followed the revelation of the mortgage fraud. The audio resumed at precisely 28 minutes and 14 seconds. The recording crackled slightly before Beatrice's voice steadied her tone, dropping into a cold, clinical register that chilled the air in the room. "Richard could not pull off a $300,000 fraud by himself," Beatrice stated, her words carrying the heavy weight of a woman who knew exactly how her legacy was being dismantled. "He is too careless with paperwork. He needed someone with a notary seal and a flexible moral compass to bypass the banking compliance checks. He needed someone who knew how to structure the theft to look like legitimate estate planning." Julian Pierce stopped rolling the gold pen between his fingers. The confident smirk that had been plastered across his face began to fracture. He sat rigid, his eyes locked on the small electronic device in Marcus' hand. "I found the ledger Richard carelessly left in his coat pocket on the evening of April 14th, Beatrice continued. "It detailed the distribution of the stolen equity." Julian Pierce, managing partner of this very firm, received a wire transfer of $50,000 on April 12th. The transaction was coded as a retainer for future estate management services. It was not a retainer. It was a bribe to backdate the power of attorney and legitimize the forged will they planned to use to cut you out, Chloe. The gold pen slipped from Pierce's fingers. It hit the marble table with a sharp click, rolling off the edge and landing silently on the carpet. Pierce did not move to pick it up. He stared at the spot where the pen had vanished, his face draining of color. The polished, untouchable attorney who had just threatened to destroy my career was suddenly stripped bare. I was no longer the imposing legal authority in the room. He was a co-conspirator caught on tape, admitting to a disparable offense and a federal crime. Vivian whispered, her voice trembling, as she looked at the lawyer. "Tell them she is making this up. Tell them you did not take that money." Pierce did not answer her. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, the calculation in his gaze replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. He knew better than anyone the catastrophic implications of a paper trail leading back to a fraudulent real estate transaction. He knew that if an audit uncovered that $50,000 wire transfer, aligning perfectly with the date of the forged power of attorney, his law license would be revoked, and he would face mandatory minimum sentencing for wire fraud. He had gambled his entire career on the assumption that an elderly woman was too senile to notice the theft, and he had lost. "This is insane," Richard roared, shattering the frozen tableau. He slammed his fists onto the table and pushed himself to his feet, kicking his chair backward. It collided heavily with the glass wall behind him. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted in a mask of desperate rage. "You generated this. You used that artificial intelligence software to synthesize her voice and manufacture these lies. You are a psycho, Chloe. You are trying to tear this family apart because you are a greedy, spiteful brat." Richard was unraveling. The calculated facade of the grieving patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic flailing of a man watching the walls of his prison cell closing in around him. He needed to destroy the evidence. He needed to silence the recording before any more details leaked into the open air. "Sterling, get that phone," Richard commanded, his voice cracking with panic. "Do not let them leave this room with it. Grab it now." Sterling hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting between the furious, demanding face of his uncle and the imposing figure of my brother-in-law standing between him and the device. But the promise of the stolen money, the lifestyle he was currently wearing on his back, overrode his common sense. Sterling lunged across the space, aiming a reckless, sweeping grab toward Marcus' extended arm. He never even came close to touching the phone. Marcus did not brace for an impact. He simply shifted his weight, sidestepping the clumsy grab. As Sterling momentum carried him forward off balance and exposed, Marcus brought his left arm down in a swift, controlled motion. He caught Sterling by the collar of his expensive maroon suit and used the younger man's own momentum against him. Marcus twisted his hips and drove Sterling downward. The impact was loud and decisive. Sterling hit the carpet hard, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. He scrambled, trying to push himself back up, his hands slipping on the slick fabric of his suit. Before Sterling could gain his footing, Marcus stepped forward, planting his heavy leather shoe firmly on the carpet, just inches from Sterling, grasping fingers. "Do not get up," Marcus warned. His voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling promise of severe physical consequences. "You stay right there on the floor until I tell you otherwise. You take one more step toward my wife's sister, and I will ensure you leave this building in a neck brace. Do we understand each other?" Sterling froze, his chest heaving as he stared at the polished leather shoe. He slowly pulled his hands back, pressing himself flat against the floor, effectively neutralized. The atmosphere in the boardroom was toxic, thick with the threat of escalating violence. Richard stood by his overturned chair, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, but unwilling to engage Marcus directly after watching his nephew get dismantled in less than 2 seconds. Vivian was sobbing quietly into her hands, the reality of her impending ruin finally breaking through her denial. Pierce remained seated, staring blankly at the wall, mentally calculating the years he would spend in federal prison. I looked at the three of them. They had tried to rob a dying woman, frame me as a lunatic, and use the legal system as a weapon to cover their tracks. They thought they were untouchable because they held the forged paperwork. But I was not just relying on a voice memo to bury them. The audio was merely the introduction. It was time to present the closing argument. I reached into my sleek leather tote bag resting on the floor beside my chair. I did not pull out another electronic device. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope secured tightly with a red string tie, the kind of envelope that holds documents, not digital files. "You claim the audio is fake, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his heavy breathing. "You claim I synthesized her voice to frame you. But you seem to forget what I do for a living. I am a certified fraud examiner. I do not walk into a boardroom with a theory. I walk in with the receipts." I unwound the red string and opened the flap of the envelope. I pulled out a stack of paper, crisp and official, and tossed it onto the center of the marble table. The document slid across the polished surface, fanning out in front of the stunned attorney and the hyperventilating thieves. "Let us see if your artificial intelligence excuse holds up against federal banking records." The heavy stack of documents hit the polished marble table with a definitive thud. The papers slid across the smooth stone surface, fanning out in a pristine, undeniable display of financial forensics. The thick packet stopped right in front of Richard, the top page, bearing the unmistakable red ink stamp of a federal banking institution. I did not break eye contact with my uncle. He stood paralyzed by his overturned leather chair, his chest heaving as the adrenaline of his recent outburst collided with sudden paralyzing dread. "Artificial intelligence cannot forge a federal bank seal, Uncle Richard Thirsty," said, my voice steady and surgical. "Software algorithms cannot retroactively generate SWIFT transfer codes or backdate clearinghouse receipts across 3 different financial institutions." I gestured toward the scattered pages. The evidence did not require a dramatic presentation. The numbers spoke for themselves. As a compliance auditor, I spend my life tracing the invisible threads of stolen money. People who commit fraud always believe they are smarter than the system. They rely on the assumption that nobody will look closely enough at the mundane details. They count on the sheer volume of paperwork to hide their crimes. But when you know exactly where to look, the paper trail glows like neon in the dark. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, resting my fingertips on the edge of the marble. I brought the receipts. Page 1 details the reverse mortgage origination on Beatrice's apartment. It shows the exact date the fraudulent power of attorney was submitted to the underwriter. Page 2 contains the wire transfer logs from her primary checking account. Page 3 holds the routing information for every single offshore and domestic account you and Vivian used to hide the funds. Julian Pierce, still sitting at the head of the table, reached out with a trembling hand. The polished attorney who minutes ago had threatened to ruin my career pulled the closest document toward him. It was the transaction log for his own firm. He stared at the page. His eyes tracked the line items. He saw his own escrow account routing number printed in black and white, aligned perfectly with a $50,000 deposit categorized under false pretenses. The color drained entirely from his face. He dropped the paper as if the physical document had burned his fingers. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a grand jury indictment. The audio recording was just the index I explained, keeping my tone flat and instructional. "The documents on this table are the textbook. Every single penny my grandmother mentioned in her voice. Memo matches these banking records down to the decimal point. $4,000 for fictitious plumbing. $12,000 for non-existent in-home nursing. $300,000 of stolen equity. I tracked it all." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed him. The arrogant patriarch of the Hayes family was suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. On the floor, Sterling let out a sharp, ragged breath. He was still pressing himself into the carpet, obeying Marcus' previous command to stay down. But one of the fanned-out documents had slid close to his right hand. The heading on the page was clearly visible from his vantage point. Sterling squinted at the paper. His eyes widened. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, ignoring the imposing presence of my brother-in-law looming above him. He pulled the sheet of paper closer to his face. It was a ledger detailing a series of high-yield deposits into a corporate checking account registered under the name Sterling Innovations. Sterling's face flushed a sickly shade of gray. The flashy maroon designer suit he wore suddenly looked like a prison uniform. He looked up at his mother, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Mom, what is this?" Sterling's voice cracked, pitching high with fear. "Why is my company name on this list?" Vivian refused to look at him. She stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were stark white. I answered for her. "Because your mother needed a place to clean the money she was draining from Beatrice retirement funds. She could not deposit $12,000 into her own accounts without triggering a tax audit. So she funneled the cash into your business accounts under the guise of seed investments." I looked down at my cousin. The arrogant man who had tried to shove me at the cemetery was now trembling on the floor of a corporate boardroom. "Your entire startup was funded by elder abuse Sterling." I kept my voice devoid of sympathy. "Every designer suit you bought, every luxury car lease you signed was paid for with money stolen from a dying woman. That makes you an accessory to wire fraud and money laundering. Ignorance of the source of funds is not a viable defense in a federal prosecution." Sterling scrambled backward, pressing his back against the glass wall. He looked at Vivian, his eyes wide with betrayal. "You used my company. You put my name on stolen money. I did not know about this. I did not sign up for this." "Shut up, Sterling," Vivian hissed. The elegant facade of the wealthy grieving daughter had completely evaporated. She looked feral. Her perfectly styled hair was out of place, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. The illusion of the high society Hayes family was stripped away, leaving nothing but a syndicate of common thieves turning on each other the moment the lights were turned on. Richard ran a hand over his face, leaving a streak of sweat across his forehead. He looked at the documents, then at the broken phone, then at Pierce. The lawyer offered no help. Pierce simply stared at the table, paralyzed by the destruction of his livelihood. They had no legal maneuvers left. They could not dispute the bank records. They could not discredit the auditor who compiled them. They were trapped in a glass cage on the 14th floor, and the walls were closing in fast. Vivian realized the logic of the situation offered no escape. The paperwork was an ironclad death sentence for their freedom and their social standing. If she could not win on the facts, she had to change the rules of engagement entirely. She had to destroy the messengers before the message could leave the room. Vivian stood up. She did not reach for the documents. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands shook as she unlocked the screen, but her eyes were cold, calculating and filled with an ancient, dangerous malice. She looked directly at Marcus. She looked at his broad shoulders, his dark skin, and his imposing stance. She knew exactly what kind of narrative played best to emergency dispatchers. She knew how to weaponize the system. Vivian tapped 3 numbers into her keypad and pressed the phone to her ear. "Aunt Vivian," I warned, stepping forward. "Whatever you are about to do is only going to add filing a false police report to your list of federal charges." She ignored me. A sick, triumphant smile touched the corners of her mouth as the call connected. Her entire physical demeanor shifted in the span of a single second. The calculating thief vanished, replaced instantly by the hysterical, terrified victim. "Yes, please, I need help immediately," Vivian cried into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, trembling with perfectly manufactured terror. Tears began to spill over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive makeup. "We are at the Pearson Associates law firm downtown, 14th floor. We are being attacked." Richard's head snapped up. He watched his wife execute the desperate maneuver, his eyes widening as he grasped the strategy. "My niece and her husband barged into our private meeting," Vivian sobbed, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. "They locked the doors. They are demanding money. The husband is a massive guy. He is out of control. He just assaulted my son. He threw him to the floor and is threatening to kill us if we do not hand over our bank accounts." She let out a staged, breathless gasp, gripping the edge of the marble table for support. "Please hurry. He is being violent. We are terrified for our lives. They have our lawyer cornered. Please send officers right now." She listened to the dispatcher for a moment, rattling off the exact building address and suite number. Yes, please hurry. He is going to hurt us." Vivian ended the call and lowered the phone. The hysterical tears vanished as quickly as they had appeared. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and stared at me across the marble table. The predatory smile returned to her face. "The police are 2 minutes away," Chloe Vivian stated, her voice returning to its normal icy pitch. "When they walk through those doors, they are going to see a large, aggressive man standing over my injured son. They are going to see you attempting to extort grieving relatives with stolen bank documents. Who do you think they are going to believe, a respected real estate developer and a prominent attorney, or two violent intruders attempting a shakedown? The trap was sprung. She had inverted the reality of the room, using the prevailing prejudices of society as a shield for her own crimes. She believed the arrival of law enforcement would force us to flee or result in our immediate arrest, burying the evidence in the chaos of a criminal investigation against us. The clock was ticking. Sirens would soon echo through the downtown corridors. The pressure in the room escalated to a suffocating level. Vivian stood tall, waiting for the panic to set in, waiting for me to realize that the truth no longer mattered when the police arrived with weapons drawn. The echo of Vivian manufactured panic faded into the sterile, humming air of the boardroom. The countdown had begun. Within minutes, law enforcement would flood the 14th floor, adrenaline surging, expecting a violent home invasion scenario. They had weaponized the emergency response system, betting that the ensuing chaos would bury the meticulous paper trail scattered across the marble table. But the arrival of the police was a double-edged sword. Once authorities breached those doors, Richard and Vivian would lose their final opportunity to control the evidence privately. The threat of an incoming squad car forced them to play their last remaining card. The strategy pivoted rapidly. Intimidation had failed. Violence was neutralized by Marcus. False police reports were already in motion. The only tactic left in the playbook of desperate thieves was bribery. Richard stepped away from his overturned chair. He moved deliberately around the edge of the large table, ignoring the fanned-out bank statements. He approached me, closing the physical distance, until I was forced to take half a step backward, my shoulders grazing the cold glass wall of the conference room. Vivian flanked him, moving to my left, effectively boxing me into the corner. Sterling remained paralyzed on the carpet behind them, clutching the ledger that detailed his complicity. Julian Pierce stayed seated, a silent, sweating observer to his client's final frantic maneuver. Richard lowered his voice, abandoning the roaring anger for a dangerous low hiss, the kind of voice he used to bully contractors into accepting unfavorable terms. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe. You have exactly 2 minutes before those elevator doors open and uniforms walk in here with weapons drawn." He leaned closer. I could smell the stale coffee and sharp mint on his breath. "You think those pieces of paper mean anything when the police walk into a room with a screaming mother and her injured son?" Richard asked, gesturing toward Sterling on the floor. "I play golf with the deputy chief of the precinct that responds to this district. When they arrive, I will tell them you hacked into my private business network to steal those documents. I will tell them you have been harassing your aunt for inheritance money. You will be arrested for felony data breach and extortion before you can even explain your spreadsheets." Vivian crossed her arms, her designer silk scarf slipping slightly on her shoulder. She offered a tight, cruel smile. "He is right, Chloe. Your entire career is built on a spotless background check. A felony arrest for financial extortion. You will be stripped of your auditing credentials by sunset. You will never work in a corporate compliance department again. You will lose everything you have spent the last 10 years building. It was a precise, calculated strike at my livelihood. They knew my professional reputation was my armor. By threatening to brand me as an extortionist, they were trying to sever my connection to the very authority I was using to expose them. They expected the prospect of career annihilation to break my resolve. I maintained eye contact with Richard. I did not blink. I did not offer a defense. Interpreting my silence as hesitation, Richard pushed his advantage. He shifted from threats to negotiation. "But it does not have to end like that." Richard continued, his tone smoothing out, adopting the false reasonability of a seasoned negotiator closing a difficult deal. "We are family. We should handle this privately." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather checkbook. He clicked a silver pen. "How much do you want?" Richard asked, his eyes darting to the broken iPhone resting near the edge of the table. "Name your price. $200,000, $250. He poised the pen over the paper. "I will write you a check right now, drawn from my personal corporate account. It will clear by tomorrow morning. You take the money, you gather up those bank statements, and you hand over that phone so we can delete the audio file. You walk out of here before the police arrive, and we tell them it was a misunderstanding. A simple argument that got out of hand. You get rich, and your auditing license stays pristine." Vivian leaned in, her voice dripping with venomous encouragement. "It is a generous offer, Chloe. More money than you make in 3 years staring at tax returns. Take the deal. Be smart. Because if you do not, I promise you, I will make sure the arresting officers put you in handcuffs right in front of your precious brother-in-law." The offer hung in the cold, conditioned air. $250,000 to walk away and let them keep the remaining spoils of Beatrice's life. It was the ultimate insult. They were attempting to purchase my silence using the very funds they had stolen from my grandmother. They stared at me, waiting for the inevitable capitulation. They believed everyone had a price. They believed that when faced with the destruction of a hard-earned career or a lucrative payout, human greed would always win. I looked at the silver pen hovering over the checkbook. I looked at the smug, predatory certainty etched into Vivian's face. I remained perfectly silent. Vivian scoffed, shaking her head. "She thinks she is a martyr, Richard. She thinks she is going to take us down. She does not realize she is already standing on the gallows." They were so hyper-focused on cornering me against the glass, so entirely consumed by their own desperate negotiation, that they suffered a catastrophic failure of situational awareness. They forgot about the other person in the room. They forgot about Marcus. While Vivian and Richard were crowding me, delivering their threats and dangling their bribes, Marcus had not moved from his position near the center of the table. He stood casually, his posture relaxed but alert. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding his own smartphone, and he was not pointing it at the floor. He held the device at chest height, the camera lens angled perfectly to capture the entire corner of the boardroom. The lighting was excellent. The audio pickup was flawless. Marcus had not been intimidated by Vivian's frantic 911 call. He had simply initiated a countermeasure of his own. As a cybersecurity expert, he understood that digital evidence is only vulnerable if it remains isolated. The moment data is distributed across a network, it becomes immortal. "Hey, Richard," Marcus said calmly, his deep voice slicing through the tense atmosphere. "Before you sign that check, you might want to consider your audience." Richard and Vivian snapped their heads toward Marcus, annoyed by the interruption. "What are you talking about?" Richard snapped, tucking the checkbook back into his jacket pocket. "Put that phone away." Marcus did not lower the device. He tapped the screen once. "I am not recording a video for my personal archives." Richard Marcus explained, his tone conversational and terrifyingly polite. I started a live broadcast the moment Vivian hung up with dispatch. The color vanished from Richard's face. A live broadcast to who? Marcus smiled. A brief, humorless expression. "I am broadcasting to the private Facebook group Vivian created last week to coordinate the funeral arrangements, the one that includes all 75 members of your extended family." Vivian gasped a raw, strangled sound. "I also took the liberty of tagging the official social media profiles of your top 3 commercial real estate partners." Marcus added, his eyes locking onto Richard. "I suspect they might be interested in watching their primary developer attempt to bribe a federal compliance auditor to cover up elder abuse and mortgage fraud." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Vivian's hands flew to her mouth. Richard stumbled a half-step backward, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the small, glowing lens of Marcus' phone. They had just spent the last 3 minutes detailing their crimes, outlining their strategy to lie to the police, and offering $250,000 in hush money. They had delivered a pristine, unassailable confession. And they had done it live on the internet, broadcasting directly to every single person they had spent the last 2 years deceiving. The false narrative of the grieving, devoted family was obliterated. The carefully curated reputation Richard relied upon to secure lucrative development contracts was instantly vaporized. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin, and every business associate had just watched them threaten to destroy my career to protect their stolen wealth. "You cannot do that!" Vivian shrieked, her voice shattering. "Turn it off! Turn it off right now!" She lunged toward Marcus, but the fight had completely left her. Her knees buckled slightly, the reality of her social and financial annihilation crushing her under its immense weight. She was no longer a wealthy socialite dictating terms from a high-rise boardroom. She was a documented criminal caught on tape. I stepped away from the glass wall, moving past Richard's paralyzed form. I walked to the center of the table, feeling the cold, hard marble under my fingertips. "You wanted an audience, Aunt Vivian," I said softly, looking down at the scattered bank statements. "You invited the police to the party. We just made sure the rest of the family got a front-row seat." A distant rising wail pierced the thick glass of the windows. Sirens. They were echoing through the concrete canyons of downtown Seattle, growing louder and more insistent by the second. The emergency response Vivian had summoned to destroy me was arriving, but the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The trap they set had snapped shut around their own ankles. The wail of police sirens intensified, echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers, until the piercing sound seemed to vibrate within the glass walls of the boardroom. Red and blue lights flashed briefly against the distant windows, signaling the arrival of the patrol units in the plaza below. The chaos Vivian had summoned was at the doorstep. Despite the catastrophic exposure of the live stream, Julian Pierce began to reconstruct his legal armor. The attorney had spent decades navigating the murky waters of corporate litigation. He understood that a public relations disaster, while devastating, was not the equivalent of a criminal conviction. He drew a deep breath, smoothing his lapels, and systematically detached himself from the panicking relatives flanking the table. Pierce stood up slowly, picking up his gold pen. He tapped it methodically against the marble, his face hardening into a mask of supreme practiced arrogance. "You think you have won because you embarrassed them on the internet?" Chloe Pierce asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "The live stream is a minor headache, a scandal for the country club. But legally, you are standing on sand." He gestured dismissively toward the fanned-out bank statements. "You obtained those financial records without a subpoena. You lack a judicial warrant to access my firm escrow logs. Furthermore, the audio recording you played earlier remains entirely inadmissible under state wiretapping statutes. Any competent defense attorney will have that evidence suppressed before a preliminary hearing even convenes. You have no legal standing to present stolen documents to the authorities." Pierce sneered, his confidence returning as he outlined his defense strategy. "When those officers walk through that door, I will formally request your arrest for corporate espionage. Those papers on the table, they are legally worthless to a prosecutor. They are fruit of the poisonous tree." He was correct about the fundamental rules of evidence. A prosecutor cannot build a case on documentation acquired through illicit means. Pierce was betting his freedom on the assumption that my initial breach of the banking privacy firewalls rendered the data useless for a criminal indictment. He believed the strict parameters of the justice system would inadvertently shield his corruption. He did not account for the fact that we had not stopped gathering evidence at the bank statements. Marcus lowered his phone, ending the live broadcast. He slipped the device into his pocket and unzipped his heavy black laptop bag, resting on the chair beside him. "Financial records require a subpoena to compel disclosure," Julian Marcus stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room. "You are absolutely right about that. The banking privacy laws are very robust." Marcus pulled out a sleek, matte black laptop and set it firmly on the marble table. He flipped the screen open. The display flared to life, illuminating lines of dense scrolling code. "But you seem to be operating under the misconception that banking records are the only evidence linking you to this conspiracy." Marcus continued, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. Pierce stopped tapping his pen. His arrogant smirk faltered slightly. "What are you babbling about?" "As a cybersecurity architect, I deal with corporate vulnerability protocols every day," Marcus explained, not looking up from his screen. "I know that corrupt attorneys never orchestrate a fraud's communicate. They leave a digital footprint because they require coordination to execute the theft. So while Chloe was tracking the money through the financial institutions, I decided to take a look at the communication network of this specific law firm." Pierce's jaw tightened. "You hacked my firm's servers. That is a federal offense. You just confessed to a cybercrime in front of witnesses." Marcus let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I did not hack anything, Julian. I did not need to break through your firewalls because your IT department is appallingly incompetent." He tapped a final command on his keyboard and swiveled the laptop around, pushing it across the smooth marble so the screen faced the panicked attorney directly. "You use a cloud-based backup system for your internal email server," Marcus detailed, his tone shifting into a clinical instructional register. "A standard protocol for disaster recovery. You correctly assumed that deleting the emails detailing the bribery arrangement from your local desktop client would erase them from your immediate view." Pierce stared at the glowing screen. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. However, Marcus continued, leaning forward and resting his hands on the table. "You failed to configure the retention policies on your cloud backups. Those deleted emails were archived automatically. They have been sitting in a poorly secured, publicly accessible cloud storage bucket for the past 3 weeks because your administrator forgot to update the encryption keys after a routine software patch. It is not hacking if you leave the front door wide open and the data exposed on the public internet. It is simply an open-source intelligence gathering exercise. I looked at the screen. It displayed a high-resolution capture of an email thread. The sender was Julian Pierce. The recipient was Richard Hayes. The timestamp was April 10th, 2 days before the $50,000 wire transfer. The subject line read, "Estate Restructuring and Risk Mitigation." The body of the email was devastatingly explicit. It outlined the exact strategy for backdating the power of attorney. It explicitly instructed Richard on how to structure the medical reports to feign Beatrice's cognitive decline. It established the $50,000 fee as the required compensation for processing the fraudulent paperwork through the title company. It was an unassailable digital confession of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. An email sent from your firm domain detailing a criminal conspiracy is not protected by attorney-client privilege, Julian stated, stepping up beside Marcus. The crime-fraud exception shatters that protection entirely. And unlike my bank statements, this email thread was not obtained through restricted channels. It was sitting in a public directory. It is fully admissible. Pierce was ruined. The airtight legal defense he had constructed over the last 5 minutes disintegrated into digital dust. The bank statements proved the money moved. The voice memo provided the motive. But the emails provided the explicit, undeniable proof of a coordinated criminal enterprise. Marcus had severed his final lifeline. The silence in the room was brittle, stretched to the breaking point. Pierce stared at the laptop screen, his mouth slightly open, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the inevitable impact with the ground below. Before Pierce could formulate a response, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom were thrown violently open. "Seattle Police, nobody move. Keep your hands where I can see them." 3 uniformed officers surged into the conference room, moving with the rapid, aggressive intensity of a tactical response unit. They fanned out instantly, their hands resting cautiously on the grips of their holstered firearms. Their eyes scanned the room, assessing the threat level based on the frantic, terrifying narrative Vivian had provided to the emergency dispatcher. They expected to find a violent intruder brutalizing a grieving family. They expected chaos, screaming, and physical danger. Instead, they found 2 professionals standing calmly behind a laptop, an attorney staring blankly at a screen, a young man cowering on the floor, and a wealthy couple frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing terror. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression and a radio crackling on his shoulder, locked his gaze on Marcus. The officer assessed Marcus' height and build, matching the physical description Vivian had frantically relayed over the phone. "Step away from the table, sir," the officer commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through the thick tension of the boardroom. "Keep your hands visible." The endgame had arrived. The authorities were in the room, operating under a false premise designed to initiate an immediate, forceful arrest. The volatile situation required delicate handling to prevent a catastrophic escalation. The truth needed to pivot faster than the police could act. The arrival of law enforcement triggered an immediate theatrical escalation from my aunt. Vivian recognized the shifting dynamic and lunged for the narrative advantage. She threw herself toward the lead officer, bursting into fresh, frantic tears. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Vivian cried, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, then jabbed it toward me. "They barged in here and locked the doors. That man attacked my son, and my niece is trying to extort us for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She is threatening to release stolen documents if we do not pay her. Please, you have to arrest them." Sterling, taking his cue, scrambled awkwardly from the carpet. He clutched his shoulder, groaning, as if he had sustained a grievous injury, leaning heavily against the glass wall. "They are psycho, man. He just threw me down for no reason." The lead officer held up a hand to pause Vivian's frantic accusations. He signaled his 2 partners, who immediately flanked Marcus and me, narrowing the physical distance. The posture of the police was cautious, but distinctly hostile toward us, conditioned by the 911 dispatch describing a violent home invasion scenario. "Sir, ma'am, step away from the desk," the lead officer ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Hand over the electronic devices. We need to secure the area." They were preparing to confiscate the evidence and initiate an arrest based on the preliminary fabricated report. Richard let out a ragged sigh of relief, leaning back against the marble table. He believed the cavalry had arrived to suppress the documents and silence the accusations. Pierce adjusted his tie, his confidence momentarily flickering back to life as the immediate threat of the digital confession was overshadowed by the immediate threat of police action. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not raise my voice to argue. I reached slowly, deliberately inside the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. "Keep your hands visible," the officer to my left barked his hand, dropping sharply to his utility belt. "I am retrieving my identification, officer," I stated calmly, ensuring my movements were smooth and non-threatening. I extracted a slim leather credential wallet and flipped it open, extending it toward the lead officer. The gold shield of a certified fraud examiner caught the overhead fluorescent light. My federal compliance credentials were prominently displayed alongside my professional identification. "I am not extorting anyone." "Officer," I explained, my voice maintaining a clinical professional register. "I am executing my mandated reporting duties regarding a significant financial crime. The individuals in this room are currently implicated in a coordinated conspiracy involving elder abuse wire fraud and the forging of a power of attorney to secure a fraudulent $300,000 reverse mortgage." The lead officer paused, his eyes scanning the official credentials. The aggressive posture of his partners relaxed marginally. A federal auditor claiming a complex financial crime presented a radically different operational scenario than a violent domestic dispute. Vivian shrieked, outraged by the disruption of her narrative. "Do not listen to her. She is lying. She is a disgruntled relative trying to steal our inheritance. Arrest her." The officer held up his hand again, silencing her. "Ma'am, please step back." He turned his attention back to me. "Miss Hayes, while your credentials establish your profession, this remains an active disturbance call. You cannot simply commandeer a private office and present banking records without proper jurisdictional authority. If you suspect fraud, you are required to file a report through official channels, not confront the suspects directly." He was technically correct regarding protocol. A lone auditor, regardless of certification, cannot act as an independent law enforcement agency during a civil dispute. Richard smirked, sensing the procedural hesitation in the officer voice. "Exactly," Richard interjected smoothly, regaining his footing. "This is a civil estate matter that my niece is attempting to weaponize. These documents are illegally obtained, and she has no authority to detain us or interrogate us in my attorney-private office." The pendulum was swinging back toward the perpetrators. The police were reluctant to mediate a complex financial dispute and were leaning toward clearing the room and directing everyone to civil court. If Richard and Vivian walked out of that building, the digital trails would be erased by midnight and the stolen money would be wired to untouchable offshore accounts before the banking sector opened on Monday. I smiled, a small, cold expression that made Richard's smirk falter. "You are entirely correct, officer," I agreed, slipping my credential wallet back into my pocket. "I do not possess the jurisdictional authority to detain these individuals or seize these premises." I glanced toward the open double doors of the boardroom. "But she does." A woman stepped out from the hallway and crossed the threshold into the conference room. She wore a sharp charcoal gray pantsuit, her demeanor radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic environments. She bypassed the patrol officers and approached the head of the marble table, stopping directly in front of Julian Pierce. "Agent Sarah Harris, Adult Protective Services Financial Exploitation Division," the woman announced, flashing a high-level state credential badge. "Miss Hayes contacted my office earlier this morning regarding credible allegations of severe financial abuse against her late grandmother. I have been monitoring the situation from the hallway for the past 20 minutes. The temperature in the room plummeted. Vivian's face, previously flushed with manufactured outrage, drained to a stark, terrifying white. The blood seemed to vanish from her veins. Agent Harris turned to the lead patrol officer. "Officer, the 911 call you responded to was a fraudulent diversion tactic. The individuals who placed that call are currently the subjects of an active state investigation. I am formally requesting that you secure this boardroom. Nobody leaves. Nobody touches these documents or electronic devices." The lead officer blinked, processing the rapid shift in command. "Understood, Agent Harris." He gestured to his partners. "Secure the exits. Ensure no files are removed from the table." The patrol officers immediately pivoted, blocking the doorway and stepping between Pierce and the laptop Marcus had deployed. The room was effectively locked down, not for a violent assault, but for a high-level financial crimes investigation. Richard staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled onto dry land. He looked at Agent Harris, then at the police officers now guarding the exits, and finally at me. The realization of his complete and utter defeat washed over him, physically collapsing his posture. "You called APS." Richard croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "You planned this. You do not corner a compliance auditor and expect them to play by your rules." "Uncle Richard," I replied, my tone devoid of pity. "I knew you would attempt to force a signature today. I knew you would try to bury the evidence. I simply ensured the appropriate authorities were present to witness the burial." Sterling sank back down onto the carpet, burying his face in his hands, realizing the scope of the disaster he had been dragged into. Julian Pierce remained frozen in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The brilliant legal mind was paralyzed by the inescapable reality that he had just incriminated himself in front of a federal auditor, a cybersecurity expert, and an agent from Adult Protective Services. The illusion of their untouchable wealth and status was completely shattered. They were no longer the powerful Hayes family dictating terms to a grieving niece. They were suspects detained in a crime scene surrounded by the physical and digital evidence of their own corruption. But as Agent Harris began pulling gloves from her pocket to catalog the evidence on the table, Richard's sudden harsh laughter sliced through the quiet tension of the room. It was not a laugh of surrender. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that sent a fresh wave of unease rippling through the glass walls. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes burning with a venomous, arrogant certainty that defied the handcuffs waiting for him. The harsh, jagged sound of Richard's laughter echoed off the glass walls of the conference room, slicing through the heavy tension that had settled over the space following Agent Harris' arrival. It was an unsettling noise, devoid of humor, yet thick with a venomous, arrogant triumph that seemed entirely out of place given the staggering amount of evidence currently being cataloged on the marble table. Vivian, who had been weeping silently into her hands, looked up startled by the sudden outburst. Sterling paused his sniffling on the carpet, bewildered. Even Julian Pierce, who had been staring blankly at the ceiling, contemplating his disbarment, lowered his gaze to Richard, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. Richard stepped away from the table, his posture straightening. The panic that had gripped him moments before evaporated, replaced by the smug, calculating demeanor of a man who believed he had discovered a fatal flaw in his opponent's strategy. He looked directly at me, his expression twisting into a sneer of pure, unfiltered malice. "You really think you have won, do you not, Chloe?" Richard taunted, his voice rising, carrying the aggressive confidence of a bully who thinks he holds the final trump card. "You think a dramatic speech and a few bank statements are going to change the outcome of this afternoon. You think Agent Harris is going to march in here and hand you the keys to the kingdom." He gestured dismissively toward the fanned-out documents that Agent Harris was currently photographing. "You might cause me a headache with those transfer logs. I might have to pay some administrative fines, maybe settle a civil dispute regarding the power of attorney. I have expensive lawyers for that." He shot a brief warning glance at Pierce. "But you missed the entire point of this meeting." Richard walked slowly toward the head of the table, his eyes locked on the heavy blue-bound folder resting near Julian Pierce's hand. "The forged will. You brought an audio recording." Chloe Richard continued, his tone dripping with condescending superiority. "A very emotional, very dramatic 47-minute diary entry from a bitter old woman. But you forgot one crucial detail about probate law in the state of Washington." He picked up the forged will, holding it aloft like a trophy. "A voice memo on a broken iPhone is not a legally binding testamentary document," Richard declared, his voice booming across the room. "It lacks witnesses. It lacks a notary seal. It is a digital ghost. It holds absolutely zero weight in determining the distribution of a multi-million-dollar estate." Pierce sat up slightly straighter, the gears in his legal mind turning rapidly as he grasped the technicality Richard was exploiting. The attorney nodded, his voice regaining a fraction of its former polish. "He is correct," Miss Hayes Pierce confirmed, addressing me while keeping a wary eye on Agent Harris. Regardless of the allegations surrounding the financial management during Mrs. Hayes' life, the only legally recognized instrument dictating the post-mortem distribution of her assets is the physical written will executed prior to her passing. The document I hold is properly formatted, witnessed, and filed. The audio recording cannot supersede a written will. Richard laughed again, a harsh, victorious bark. You hear that, Chloe? You can wave those bank statements in front of the police all day long. You can accuse us of whatever you want. But when the dust settles, this piece of paper dictates who gets the penthouse and who gets the portfolio. And this piece of paper explicitly cuts you out. He slammed the blue folder back down onto the marble table, leaning forward, his face flushed with adrenaline. You get nothing, Richard roared, pointing a finger at my chest. I inherit the real estate. Vivian inherits the liquid assets. We still win. You put on a great show, but you are walking out of this building empty-handed, just like you walked in. You are a glorified accountant playing lawyer, and you failed. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocating. The sickening reality of the legal loophole hung in the air. Richard and Vivian were banking on the rigid, uncompromising structure of the probate system to shield their ultimate prize. They believed that even if they faced consequences for the preceding financial abuse, the estate itself, the massive accumulation of wealth they had coveted for years, would remain securely in their grasp due to the technical superiority of the forged document. Vivian wiped her tears, a triumphant smirk beginning to form through her ruined makeup. She stood up, her posture regaining its haughty arrogance. She is right, Richard. We do not have to listen to this anymore. The will is valid. Let the police review the bank transfers. Our legal team will handle it. But the estate belongs to us. Sterling scrambled up from the floor, dusting off his maroon suit, his confidence returning as his mother and uncle reasserted their dominance. Yeah, Chloe, nice try, but you lost. The patrol officers standing by the doors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. They were present to secure a potential crime scene regarding financial exploitation, but they lacked the authority to arbitrate a complex probate dispute. The legal technicality Richard presented was a significant hurdle. If the written will remain the only recognized testamentary document, the vast majority of the assets would indeed transfer to the perpetrators, rewarding their corruption with millions of dollars. Agent Harris paused, her cataloging her expression tightening as she recognized the frustrating reality of the legal framework. She knew that dismantling a properly executed will in court, based solely on circumstantial audio evidence, would require years of grueling, expensive litigation, a battle I currently lacked the resources to fight due to the ongoing cyber attack on my accounts. They were gloating. They were basking in the toxic certainty that the system they had manipulated would ultimately protect their theft. They believed the story ended there, with the villains walking away, bruised but phenomenally wealthy, leaving the victims stranded with nothing but moral high ground. I looked at Richard, flushed with victory. I looked at Vivian, sneering behind her designer sunglasses. I looked at Pierce, silently recalculating his survival odds based on his client-aggressive defense. I did not argue the legal technicality. I did not raise my voice in frustration. I simply reached across the table and picked up the shattered iPhone. "You are entirely correct, Uncle Richard," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm that caused his victorious smile to falter slightly. "A voice memo is not a legally binding will. It cannot dictate the distribution of assets." I tapped the screen, navigating back to the audio file. "But you seem to be operating under the assumption that Beatrice left that recording to serve as her final testament." I continued, my gaze locking onto his. "You think she spent 47 minutes detailing your crimes just to complain into the void? You think a woman who survived a world war and built a $3 million estate from nothing would leave her legacy unprotected against a man who struggles to balance a checkbook?" I pressed play, dragging the timeline slider to the final 2 minutes of the recording. "You are right, Richard. The audio is not the will. The audio is the map." The quiet, lethal calm in my voice seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. Richard's triumphant sneer froze the muscles in his jaw, twitching as his mind struggled to process the sudden shift in momentum. Vivian stopped adjusting her scarf, her hands dropping limply to her sides. Julian Pierce stared at the shattered iPhone resting on the marble table, a new, deeper shade of dread settling over his features. They had staked their entire defense on the rigid limitations of probate law. They believed the audio recording was merely a list of grievances, a desperate final complaint from a woman they assumed lacked the capacity to fight back. They failed to understand that Beatrice Hayes did not complain. She planned. I dragged the timeline slider on the iPhone display, watching the digital waveform until it reached the 45-minute mark. The background noise on the recording had changed. The muffled hum of the television was gone, replaced by the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock that stood in her hallway. The sound indicated she had moved to a different room, ensuring complete isolation for her final message. I pressed play. The tinny speaker of the device projected Beatrice's voice into the tense silence of the boardroom. The lingering anger that had characterized her recitation of the stolen funds had vanished. Her tone was now sharp, authoritative, and chillingly precise. Chloe, the recording began echoing off the glass walls. If you are hearing this, it means Richard and Vivian believe they have successfully executed their theft. They believe the falsified documents they forced upon me will stand uncontested. They are relying on the assumption that I was too weak to secure my own legacy. Richard swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. The transaction logs I detailed earlier were not merely a record of their crimes. Beatrice continued her enunciation meticulous. They were an index. I needed to ensure that only you, with your professional expertise and your attention to detail, could access the countermeasures I put in place. I watched the color drain completely from Vivian's face. The arrogant matriarch who had spent the morning bullying relatives at the cemetery now looked small and profoundly terrified. Take the first alphanumeric character of the routing numbers from the 12 primary fraudulent transfers I listed. Beatrice instructed, her voice steady and unwavering. Combine those 12 characters in chronological order. That sequence is the access code for safe deposit box number 842 at the First National Bank branch on 4th Avenue. The silence that followed the revelation was not just heavy, it was suffocating. It was the silence of a catastrophic realization. My grandmother had not simply documented the financial abuse. She had weaponized the very transactions her abusers used to steal from her, transforming their criminal footprint into a cryptographic key. The voice memo was not a diary entry. It was a meticulously constructed, perfectly encoded mind map designed to guide me past their legal barricades. The recording crackled slightly before Beatrice delivered her final sentence. Inside that box, you will find the instrument required to dismantle their illusions. Do not let them keep what they did not earn. The audio file ended. The screen on the shattered iPhone went dark. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The patrol officers standing by the doors exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing the scope of the investigation had just expanded dramatically. Agent Harris stopped photographing the bank statements, her gaze fixed intently on the dark screen of the phone, recognizing the strategic brilliance of the deceased woman. Richard was the first to break the paralysis. His reaction was not a legal argument or a haughty dismissal. It was pure, unadulterated panic. The realization that Beatrice had hidden something critical in a bank vault, something accessible only through the code embedded in the audio file he had just tried to dismiss as irrelevant, shattered his remaining composure. He lunged away from the table, his eyes wild, darting toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. He was not trying to attack me. He was trying to flee. He needed to reach the First National Bank branch on 4th Avenue before I did. He needed to intercept whatever Beatrice had locked away, believing that if he could physically destroy the contents of Box 842, his forged will would remain the only surviving document. "Move!" Richard roared, shoving violently past Julian Pierce, knocking the attorney's shoulder hard enough to send Pierce stumbling into the wall. Richard sprinted toward the exit, his heavy footsteps thudding against the carpet. He reached for the brushed steel handle of the door, his face contorted in a mask of desperate exertion. He never made it out of the room. The lead patrol officer, who had been observing the escalating tension, with a hand resting near his utility belt, reacted with trained, immediate precision. He stepped directly into Richard's path, utilizing his body weight to block the exit. "Whoa, hold it right there, sir," the officer commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He raised both hands, pressing his palms firmly against Richard's chest, halting the frantic escape attempt. "Get out of my way," Richard bellowed, his panic overriding his common sense. He tried to push past the uniform, his hands grappling clumsily with the officer forearms. "I have to leave. I have a family emergency." The physical resistance triggered an immediate escalation from law enforcement. The two supporting officers surged forward from their positions near the walls. They flanked Richard in seconds, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back with practiced efficiency. "Sir, stop resisting," the second officer barked, applying a joint lock that forced Richard to grimace in pain and drop to his knees. "You are not going anywhere. This area is secured pending the investigation by Adult Protective Services." "Let me go!" Richard yelled, struggling vainly against the combined strength of the two officers restraining him on the floor. "You cannot keep me here. That is my mother bank box. I am the executor of the estate," Vivian screamed, rushing toward the officers, her hands outstretched in a frantic plea. "Stop hurting him. He did not do anything wrong." Agent Harris stepped in front of Vivian, raising a hand to halt the hysterical woman advance. "Ma'am, step back immediately and remain quiet, or you will be placed in restraints as well for interfering with an active detention." Vivian recoiled, her hands flying to her mouth, staring in horror as her husband was pinned to the floor of their lawyer conference room by armed police officers. Sterling cowered in the corner, pressing himself as far into the glass wall as possible, terrified that he would be the next one forced to the ground. I watched the chaotic scene unfold with clinical detachment. Richard's desperate, foolish attempt to flee had only cemented his guilt in the eyes of the authorities. He had abandoned any pretense of innocence, reacting purely out of the terrifying knowledge that his entire scheme was collapsing. But his frantic sprint toward the door was not just desperate, it was entirely pointless. I reached into my sleek leather tote bag for the final time. I did not pull out another electronic device or a stack of bank statements. I pulled out a heavy leather-bound portfolio sealed with a prominent embossed federal court stamp. "You do not need to rush to the bank. Uncle Richard," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the sounds of the scuffle and his ragged breathing. The officers paused their securing of Richard, looking back toward the marble table. Richard, breathing heavily with his cheek pressed against the carpet, craned his neck to look at the portfolio in my hands. I already went. I tossed the leather-bound portfolio onto the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to Julian Pierce's forged will. "I decoded the audio file yesterday morning," I explained, stepping closer to the table, so every person in the room could hear the final devastating truth. "I accessed safe deposit box 842 24 hours before you even walked into the cemetery this morning." The arrogant certainty that Richard had clung to just moments before the belief that his forged document was the only legal instrument in play was about to be permanently extinguished. The contents of that portfolio were not just evidence, they were a legal execution. The heavy leather portfolio landed squarely in the center of the marble table, directly adjacent to the forged blue folder Julian Pierce had presented mere minutes earlier. The embossed seal of the United States District Court caught the fluorescent light gleaming with an authority that immediately silenced the remaining commotion in the room. Richard, still kneeling on the carpet with his arms secured behind his back by the patrol officers, ceased his struggling. He stared at the leather cover, his eyes wide, his breathing jagged. The frantic desperation of his escape attempt was replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. Vivian shrank back against the glass wall, clutching her designer handbag to her chest like a useless shield. Sterling remained huddled in his corner, refusing to look at anyone. Agent Harris stepped closer to the table, her gaze shifting from the bank statements to the newly introduced document. As a seasoned investigator of financial exploitation, she recognized the gravity of a federally sealed instrument appearing in the middle of a contested probate dispute. Julian Pierce, whose entire defense relied on the supremacy of the forged written will, stared at the portfolio as if it were a live explosive. He did not reach for it. He knew better than to touch a document that possessed the power to dismantle his entire fraudulent architecture. I rested my hand flat against the leather cover, securing it against the smooth stone. "You were entirely correct about probate law, Julian." I began, my voice steady, projecting clearly across the quieted boardroom. "A voice memo cannot supersede a written will, and the forged document you presented earlier today appears superficially to be the final testament of Beatrice Hayes." I looked down at Richard, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his impending ruin. "But you missed a fundamental principle of asset distribution. I continued. A will, regardless of its validity, can only govern the distribution of assets that actually belong to the deceased individual at the time of their death. I unclasped the leather portfolio and folded back the cover. Inside rested a thick stack of pristine watermarked paper, bound not by a cheap plastic spine, but by the heavy official ribbon of a specialized trust attorney. This, I announced, tapping the top page, is the Beatrice Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust, executed 24 months ago, drafted and managed by a boutique legal firm located in Portland, Oregon, intentionally outside the jurisdiction and influence of anyone in this room. The color drained entirely from Pierce's face. His jaw went slack. The polished, arrogant attorney suddenly looked incredibly small. As an expert in estate law, he understood the catastrophic implications of those two words instantly. Irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is not a will, it is a legal vault. Once assets are transferred into it, the grantor relinquishes all ownership rights. The assets belong solely to the trust managed by a designated trustee and cannot be altered, amended, or revoked by the grantor, regardless of future coercion or declining mental capacity. It is the ultimate legal shield against predators. 2 years ago, Beatrice realized the depth of your greed. Richard West explained, the facts falling like hammer blows in the silent room. She recognized the danger when you began asking intrusive questions about her retirement accounts and requesting copies of the penthouse deed. She knew you would eventually attempt to force her hand. I flipped to the second page of the document detailing the schedule of assets. So she quietly transferred ownership of the penthouse on First Avenue into this trust, I read, trailing my finger down the itemized list. She liquidated her primary investment portfolios and transferred the principal balances into this trust. She moved the vast majority of her wealth completely out of her personal name long before Vivian ever began slipping sedatives into her evening tea. Vivian let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. The millions of dollars she had spent 2 years anticipating, the wealth she had sacrificed her mother's health to secure, did not exist. The forged document you hold, Julian, is technically a valid piece of paper. I continued my gaze, locking onto the attorney. The problem is that it is a will attempting to distribute an estate that is entirely empty. Beatrice died with virtually zero assets in her personal name. You spent $50,000 in bribes, forged a power of attorney, and risked federal prison to inherit a hollow shell. Richard let out a sound that was half sob, half furious growl. He strained against the officers holding him, his face contorting in an agonizing mixture of fury and absolute despair. "That is impossible!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking violently. I checked the county records. The deed to the penthouse was still in her name last month. I saw the paperwork when I filed the reverse mortgage. I smiled, a cold, surgical expression. "You checked the public registry." "Uncle Richard," I corrected him. "You saw a deed that had not yet been updated in the county database due to administrative backlogs. But the legal transfer of ownership occurred the moment Beatrice signed this trust document 2 years ago. The trust owned the penthouse." I paused, allowing the gravity of that fact to settle over him. "Which brings us to your most significant problem," I added softly. "When you forged her signature on that power of attorney last month to take out a $300,000 reverse mortgage, you did not just steal from an elderly woman. You fraudulently encumbered an asset that belonged to a federally regulated trust entity." Agent Harris crossed her arms over her chest, nodding slowly as the pieces of the investigation locked into place. "You committed mortgage fraud against a protected trust, Mr. Hayes. That elevates this from simple elder abuse to a multi-count federal indictment." The silence that followed was absolute. The intricate, meticulous web of lies and theft that Richard, Vivian, and Pierce had woven over 2 years was obliterated by a single brilliantly executed legal maneuver initiated by a woman they had dismissed as senile. Beatrice had not just protected her legacy. She had set a trap, baited it with her empty estate, and waited for their greed to compel them to step inside. They had forged documents to steal nothing, and in doing so, they had provided the exact evidence required to send themselves to federal prison. The payoff was total. There were no loopholes. There were no negotiated settlements. The law they had attempted to manipulate had become the instrument of their destruction. But the execution was not yet complete. The revelation of the empty estate shattered their defense, but the consequences of their actions required immediate, tangible enforcement. The financial damage they had inflicted before the trap was sprung still needed to be addressed. I closed the leather portfolio and turned my attention away from the devastated relatives on the floor. I looked directly at Julian Pierce, the architect who had facilitated the entire scheme. "The estate is empty," Julian, I stated, the finality of the statement hanging heavy in the boardroom air. "But the stolen funds are not. And as the designated trustee of the Beatrice Hayes Irrevocable Trust, my fiduciary duty requires me to recover every single stolen cent." The realization that they had sacrificed their freedom to inherit a Mirage broke something fundamental within the Hayes family. The boardroom, previously a theater of aggressive intimidation, was now a stagnant tomb of shattered ambitions. Richard remained slumped on the carpet, his resistance entirely exhausted, pinned beneath the insurmountable weight of his own hubris. Vivian stared blankly through the glass walls, her designer sunglasses lying abandoned on the floor, the polished veneer of her social standing dissolving into dust. They had spent 2 years sedating an old woman, forging documents and bribing attorneys. They had risked federal prison to seize a $3 million estate that had secretly evaporated long before they even initiated their scheme. The cruel irony of their situation was absolute. However, the revelation of the empty estate only nullified their future gains. It did not address the funds they had already managed to siphon during Beatrice's decline. The $400,000 extracted through the fraudulent reverse mortgage and the systematic draining of her minor operating accounts still required aggressive remediation. I was not going to allow them to retain a single stolen dollar. The punishment needed to be immediate, financial, and devastating. I leaned forward, resting my palms against the cool marble of the conference table. The silence in the room was so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. "The estate is empty," I reiterated, my voice slicing through the heavy atmosphere. "But the money you stole prior to her passing is not. You drained $400,000 from her auxiliary accounts to fund your gambling debts, your lifestyle, and your ridiculous startup ventures." I shifted my gaze from Richard to Vivian, then finally to Sterling, ensuring each of them felt the crosshairs of my focus. "You assumed those thefts would simply be written off as administrative losses once you controlled the estate as executors." I continued, detailing their flawed logic. "You believed that by inheriting the bulk of the wealth, the preliminary embezzlement would be erased by the final distribution. A convenient accounting error buried in the probate paperwork." I paused, allowing the inescapable reality of their new position to fully materialize in their minds. "But you are not the executors," I stated, the finality of the declaration striking them like a physical blow. "You are not the beneficiaries. You are simply thieves who have stolen from a federally protected trust. And as the designated trustee, my primary fiduciary obligation is the aggressive recovery of all misappropriated assets." Julian Pierce, maintaining a fragile grip on his remaining professional instincts, attempted a feeble interjection. "Miss Hayes, recovering those funds requires navigating a complex civil litigation process. You cannot simply demand immediate restitution without a court order determining liability. The burden of proof remains on the trust to establish the fraudulent nature of each individual transfer." He was clinging to the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system, hoping the bureaucratic delays would afford them time to launder the remaining cash or negotiate a settlement. He expected a protracted, expensive legal battle that would drain my resources and potentially force a compromise. He severely underestimated the aggressive capabilities available to a compliance auditor acting in tandem with federal authorities. "I did not initiate a civil lawsuit," Julian replied, my tone dismissing his legal maneuvering entirely. "I initiated an emergency asset freeze under the provisions of the Bank Secrecy Act, utilizing the evidence of wire fraud and elder exploitation to trigger immediate federal intervention." I turned my attention back to my relatives. When I accessed Safe Deposit Box 842, yesterday morning, I did not just retrieve the trust documents I explained. I also retrieved the comprehensive financial dossier Beatrice compiled. I presented that dossier along with my preliminary audit findings directly to the fraud division of the institutions holding your primary accounts. Right on cue, a synchronized vibrating hum disrupted the quiet of the boardroom. The sound originated from multiple locations simultaneously. Vivian designer handbag resting on the floor beside her chair buzzed aggressively. The jacket pocket of Richard tailored suit vibrated against the carpet. Sterling phone clutched tightly in his trembling hand lit up the corner where he crouched. The notifications were instantaneous and uniform. Sterling stared at his glowing screen. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated panic. The flashy, confident exterior he had maintained all morning vanished completely. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire future go up in flames. "My accounts," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "They are gone. The balances are gone." Vivian scrambled for her handbag, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the zipper. She pulled her phone out, unlocking the screen with frantic, uncoordinated swipes. She stared at the banking application display, her mouth falling open in a silent scream of absolute despair. The screens displayed stark, undeniable red text. Account frozen. Administrative hold. Pending investigation. Every single dollar of the stolen money, along with their own personal savings, their business operating capital, and their investment portfolios, was entirely inaccessible. The financial arteries that sustained their affluent lifestyle were severed in an instant. They could not wire funds. They could not withdraw cash. They could not even purchase a cup of coffee. Marcus stepped forward from his position near the laptop, checking his own device. He offered a cold, predatory smile that held absolutely zero warmth. The automated clearinghouse holds were processed and activated exactly 60 seconds ago, Marcus announced, his deep voice carrying the finality of a judge sentence. The algorithms verified the fraud indicators and locked everything down simultaneously. Marcus looked directly at Sterling, who was hyperventilating on the floor. "Congratulations on the successful launch of your startup." Sterling, Marcus mocked, his tone dripping with lethal sarcasm. "I hope you paid your web hosting fees in advance, because your corporate accounts are currently reporting a zero available balance. Your investors are going to be very disappointed when the federal indictments hit the newswires tomorrow morning." Sterling dropped his phone. It clattered against the glass wall. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a pathetic, muffled sob. The realization that he was not an innovative entrepreneur, but merely a pawn in a criminal conspiracy that had just destroyed his life, crushed him completely. Richard strained against the patrol officers holding him down, his face purple with rage and disbelief. "You cannot do this!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You cannot freeze my business accounts. I have payroll to meet. I have active construction projects. You are bankrupting me. You bankrupted yourself," Richard I countered, stepping closer so he could clearly hear the consequence of his greed. "When you forged a signature to steal $300,000 from your own mother, you forfeited the right to complain about financial hardship. The freeze remains in effect until the trust recovers the entirety of the stolen principal, plus damages, plus legal fees. You are ruined." The psychological collapse was total. The arrogant, untouchable Hayes family, who had entered the boardroom expecting to secure a multi-million-dollar empire, was now physically restrained, facing federal prison, and entirely destitute. The meticulously planned heist had resulted in their absolute catastrophic destruction. They had nothing left, no leverage, no money, no future. But the execution of justice required one final administrative step. The evidence was presented, the assets were frozen, and the perpetrators were broken. Now the authorities needed to formalize the consequences. Agent Harris from Adult Protective Services stepped forward, signaling the patrol officers. The time for revelations and financial maneuvering was over. It was time for the handcuffs. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of ozone and ruined lives. The financial decapitation executed by the automated banking holds had severed the final threads of their resistance. Richard lay motionless on the carpet, his breathing shallow and defeated. Sterling remained curled in the corner, paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his stolen future. Vivian stared blankly at her frozen bank account screen, the reality of her destitution rendering her mute. Only Julian Pierce retained enough presence of mind to attempt a cowardly exit. While the attention of the room was focused on the collapsing family members, the attorney slowly edged his chair backward. He kept his eyes averted from the damning documents on the table, calculating the distance to the heavy glass doors. He recognized that the situation had escalated beyond a civil dispute. The presence of Adult Protective Services and the undeniable evidence of wire fraud meant federal indictments were imminent. He needed to reach his private office, shred physical files, and contact a criminal defense attorney before the authorities formally detained him. Pierce stood up smoothly, abandoning his expensive gold pen and the forged will on the marble table. He took a silent step toward the threshold, hoping the patrol officers were too preoccupied with securing Richard to notice his departure. He underestimated the situational awareness of Agent Harris. "Officer, secure the attorney." Agent Harris commanded, her voice slicing through the quiet room with sharp, uncompromising authority. "Nobody is leaving this scene until the preliminary arrests are processed." The lead patrol officer pivoted instantly, stepping directly into Pierce's path. He raised a hand, pressing it firmly against the center of Pierce's chest, halting the lawyer escape attempt. "Hold it right there, sir," the officer instructed, his tone devoid of any deference to Pierce's expensive suit or legal credentials. "You heard the agent. Return to your seat." Pierce bristled, attempting to summon a final shred of his arrogant authority. "You cannot detain me without a warrant. I am the legal counsel for this estate. I invoke my right to remain silent and demand to contact my own representation immediately. This is a gross violation of my civil liberties. You can contact your representation from the precinct holding cell." "Julian," I interjected, ensuring he understood the severity of his position. "The crime-fraud exception has already invalidated your attorney-client privilege. The emails Marcus recovered provide probable cause for your immediate arrest as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud scheme. You are not a lawyer today. You are an accomplice." Agent Harris stepped forward, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from the back of her belt. She approached the head of the marble table, her gaze sweeping over the defeated individuals. The time for negotiation and legal maneuvering was officially terminated. The consequences were arriving in cold, hard steel. Julian Pierce, Richard Hayes, and Vivian Hayes, Agent Harris, announced, her voice ringing with the absolute power of the federal government. "You are being placed under arrest pending formal charges for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The rhythmic, metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs echoed sharply in the quiet boardroom. The lead officer forced Richard's arms higher up his back, securing the cuffs tightly around his wrists. Richard groaned in pain, his face pressed unceremoniously into the carpet. The arrogant patriarch, who had spent decades bullying contractors and manipulating his family, was reduced to a constrained, humiliated suspect. Agent Harris moved to Julian Pierce, grabbing his wrists and locking the steel bracelets into place. Pierce flinched, his jaw clenched tight, refusing to look at me or his clients. The brilliant legal mind was physically tethered, his career ending with the humiliating click of the locking mechanism. The second patrol officer approached Vivian. As the officer reached for her arms, the paralyzing shock that had gripped my aunt finally shattered. The reality of the handcuffs, the prospect of a prison cell, and the absolute destruction of her social standing collided, triggering a catastrophic emotional collapse. Vivian shrieked a raw, primal sound of pure terror. She scrambled backward, knocking her chair over, attempting to evade the advancing officer. "No, please, no, I cannot go to jail." Vivian sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "I am a respectable woman. I belong to the country club. You cannot do this to me." The officer caught her arms effortlessly, spinning her around and forcing her hands behind her back. He ignored her hysterical pleas, executing the arrest protocol with practiced efficiency. Vivian, realizing physical resistance was futile, abandoned her pride entirely. She collapsed to her knees on the carpet, dragging the officer down slightly with her weight. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her eyes wide with desperate, pathetic begging. "Chloe, please!" Vivian wailed, her voice cracking. "You cannot let them do this. We are family. I am your aunt. We only took the money because Richard investments were failing. We were desperate. We were going to lose the house. Please, Chloe, tell them to stop. I will give it all back. Have mercy on us." She was weaponizing the concept of family, attempting to manipulate my emotions, using the very ties she had exploited to rob my grandmother. She expected the sight of her humiliation to trigger some hidden reserve of familial loyalty or pity. She believed I would hesitate at the precipice of her total destruction. I did not hesitate. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of justice being executed exactly as planned. I walked slowly around the edge of the marble table, stopping just inches from where Vivian knelt on the floor. I looked down at her. I saw the expensive silk scarf, the designer shoes, and the tear-stained face of a woman who had spent 2 years slowly poisoning the person who gave her life. I crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. I maintained eye contact, ensuring she saw absolutely zero compassion in my gaze. "You talk about family, Aunt Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "But you do not know the meaning of the word. Family does not drug their mother. Family does not steal from a dying woman. You chose your path when you decided your lifestyle was more important than her life." Vivian sobbed harder, shaking her head frantically. "We were desperate, Chloe. We had no choice. You had choices every single day," I countered, cutting off her pathetic excuses. "You chose to be a thief. You chose to be a predator." I leaned in closer, my voice carrying the lethal finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "You tossed my grandmother's phone into the garbage bag because you thought her voice was worthless," I whispered, ensuring only she could hear the specific geometry of her ruin. "You threw her legacy away without a second thought. And now I have just thrown your entire life into the exact same trash can." I stood up, turning my back on her weeping form. I did not offer another word. I did not look back at Richard struggling on the floor or Pierce staring silently at the wall. I walked toward Marcus, who was already packing his laptop into his bag. The tactical strike was complete. The target was neutralized. The mission was accomplished. The officers hauled Richard and Vivian to their feet, their protests and sobbing echoing off the glass walls as they were marched out of the boardroom toward the elevators. The glittering facade of the Hayes family was being escorted out in handcuffs, heading toward a reality of concrete cells and federal indictments. "We are done here," I told Marcus, adjusting the strap of my tote bag on my shoulder. "Let us go." Marcus nodded, falling into step beside me as we exited the conference room. We walked past the empty receptionist desk, the silence of the law firm feeling heavier, cleaner, purged of the corruption that had festered within its walls. The trap had sprung flawlessly. The predators were caged. But the true legacy of Beatrice Hayes remained to be secured. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding precision that terrifies people accustomed to quick fixes and backdoor negotiations. 8 months after the arrests in the downtown boardroom, the reality of the indictments finally settled over the perpetrators. Richard and Vivian did not even attempt to take their case to trial. Faced with the undeniable bank routing logs, the audio confession, and the unsealed internal emails Marcus extracted from the cloud server, their expensive defense attorneys advised immediate surrender. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse on the morning of their sentencing hearing. The gallery was sparse. The expansive network of high society friends, country club acquaintances, and real estate partners who once flocked to their dinner parties had evaporated the moment the fraud charges became public. They stood before the judge abandoned by the very social circle they had sacrificed their morals to impress. They did not wear tailored suits or designer silk scarves. They wore standard-issue khaki facility uniforms. Their shoulders slumped under the fluorescent lights. The judge struck the wooden sounding block and handed down a severe multi-year sentence for wire fraud and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The bailiffs led them away through a heavy side door, their wrists secured in iron chains, the metallic clinking sound matching the heavy burden of their own greed. The wealthy patriarch and matriarch of the Hayes family were reduced to federal inmates. Julian Pierce met a similar definitive end. The State Bar Association did not wait for his criminal trial to conclude before taking action. They convened an emergency ethics panel based on the incontrovertible digital evidence Marcus had preserved. Pierce was permanently stripped of his license to practice law in the state of Washington. His boutique firm disbanded within days, his junior partners fleeing the toxic association to save their own careers. He traded a corner office overlooking the Seattle skyline for a concrete holding cell awaiting his own day in federal court. Sterling managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by cooperating fully with the federal prosecutors. He detailed exactly how his mother funneled stolen cash into his failing business accounts to launder the proceeds. However, avoiding a cell did not save him from the severe financial reckoning. The Internal Revenue Service and the state recovery agencies seized his leased luxury vehicles, his upscale apartment, and every cent he possessed to satisfy the victim restitution orders. I saw my cousin last week while grabbing a coffee in the financial district. He was wearing a stained beige apron, wiping down a sticky laminate table at a crowded mid-tier diner. He looked up, made eye contact with me, and immediately dropped his gaze to the floor, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. He scrubbed the table harder, avoiding my eyes. I left a generous cash tip under my coffee cup and walked out the glass doors. Justice possesses a distinct, satisfying flavor. The changing seasons brought a sharp, welcome contrast to the dark winter months spent navigating probate courts and signing federal affidavits. It was a bright, cloudless Tuesday afternoon in late May when Marcus and I returned to the building where the conflict had originated. We stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway outside Beatrice's front door. A thick strip of yellow federal seizure tape stretched across the wooden frame, placed there during the peak of the mortgage fraud investigation to prevent unauthorized entry and protect the crime scene. The investigation was officially closed. The property title had been scrubbed of the fraudulent encumbrance and formally reverted to the Irrevocable trust. I reached up and grasped the corner of the yellow adhesive tape. Marcus took the other end. Together we pulled. The harsh tearing sound of the plastic separating from the wood echoed in the empty corridor. It sounded like a heavy chain snapping, releasing the property from the dark history of the past 2 years. We folded the tape and discarded it. I slid the brass key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open, revealing a space that no longer felt like a prison for a dying woman. The stale scent of industrial bleach and medical anxiety had vanished entirely. Sunlight poured through the large bay windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm air. The apartment smelled like lemon oil and fresh linen. My older sister Maya stepped out from the kitchen area. She wiped her hands on a cloth towel, offering a bright, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She had flown in from the East Coast to help clear out the remaining negative energy from the space. She carried a silver tray holding 3 porcelain cups and a steaming ceramic teapot. We walked out onto the spacious balcony overlooking the city skyline. Maya handed a cup to her husband Marcus, then passed one to me. We stood in comfortable, easy silence, savoring the fragrant chamomile. This simple act felt profound. Months ago, this very beverage was a weapon used by Vivian to poison our grandmother mind and steal her autonomy. Today, shared in the sunlight among people who actually respected each other, it was a symbol of reclamation and peace. Maya leaned her head against Marcus' shoulder. We survived the purge. The toxic elements were successfully excised from our bloodline. The financial recovery executed by the trust was a total success. The banks reversed the fraudulent reverse mortgage, absorbing the loss due to their own failure in signature verification protocols. The $400,000 siphoned into various offshore and startup accounts were clawed back by federal agents and deposited safely into the trust ledger. But I did not absorb that wealth into my personal investment portfolio. Beatrice did not intend for me to hoard the capital. She intended for me to use it. As the sole trustee, I drafted a new charter. I utilized the recovered funds to establish the Beatrice Hayes Legal Defense Foundation. We partnered with local advocacy groups to provide aggressive forensic auditing and top-tier legal representation for elderly individuals facing financial exploitation from predatory relatives. We hire sharp, relentless lawyers who do not settle. We hunt down stolen pensions, reverse fraudulent property deeds, and ensure that financial predators face the same concrete cells that Richard and Vivian currently occupy. In our first 3 months of operation, we successfully froze the assets of 5 different abusers, returning life savings to vulnerable people who thought they had no voice. I stood on the balcony watching the sunset paint the Seattle skyline in shades of gold and violet. I thought about the 47-minute voice memo stored securely on my encrypted server. My grandmother did not just leave me a piece of real estate or a stack of bank statements. She left me a highly calibrated weapon designed to cut away the rot festering within our own family. She recognized that the people sharing her DNA were her greatest threat, and she trusted me to pull the trigger. We are conditioned by society to believe that blood requires endless forgiveness. We are told to keep the peace, to absorb the damage quietly, to protect the family name at all costs, and to look the other way when relatives cross the line. That narrative is a lie designed to protect abusers. True family is not determined by a shared last name or genetic markers. Family is defined by protection, respect, and unwavering loyalty. My aunt and uncle believed they could steal a legacy drug, a brilliant woman, and discard the truth in a garbage bag. They learned the hard way that a steel boundary enforced with cold logic and undeniable evidence is an insurmountable wall. I protected Beatrice to the very last syllable of her final message, and in doing so, I ensured her voice would continue to protect others long after she was gone. I keep Beatrice's shattered iPhone in a small velvet-lined display box on my office desk. It no longer holds a charge, the screen remains permanently black, and the glass is still splintered from the morning Vivian threw it into the trash. I do not keep it as a trophy of my victory. I keep it as a daily reminder of what it costs to stand your ground against people who share your DNA. Looking back at the wreckage and the subsequent rebirth over the past year, the dust has finally settled. The estate is secure, the predators are incarcerated, and the Legal Defense Foundation built in her name is currently protecting dozens of vulnerable clients. People often ask me how I managed to walk into that corporate law firm, surrounded by hostile relatives and a corrupt attorney, and dismantle their entire lives without ever raising my voice. The answer is simple. I did not rely on emotion. I relied on the cold architecture of reality. Through this ordeal, 3 distinct truths became my permanent guiding principles. First, the truth requires a paper trail. Predators thrive in the shadows of verbal manipulation, gaslighting, and closed-door intimidation. They rely on the assumption that you will be too overwhelmed to verify their claims. Beatrice understood that her word against theirs meant nothing to a probate judge, so she weaponized the banking system. Never fight a liar with arguments. Fight them with receipts, timestamps, and irrefutable documentation. When you hold the data, you control the narrative. Second blood dictates biology, not loyalty. Society heavily conditions us to endure immense toxicity under the guise of maintaining family ties. We are taught to absorb the damage to keep the peace. But peace built on your own silent suffering is just a hostage situation. Walking away from toxic relatives, enforcing a steel boundary, and exposing their crimes is not a betrayal. It is the highest form of self-respect. True family protects you. They do not sedate you to steal your retirement funds. Third, let them underestimate you. Richard Vivian and Julian Pierce failed because their staggering arrogance blinded them to the threat I posed. They looked at a grieving granddaughter and assumed I was an easy target. They confused my silence for submission. Never correct an opponent who assumes you are weak. Allow their overconfidence to lull them into a false sense of security while you quietly gather your ammunition. When the time comes to strike, ensure the blow is absolute, leaving no legal or financial loopholes for them to escape through. The cycle of generational abuse ends the moment someone decides the truth is more important than the family image. I made my choice, and I urge you to make yours. If you are currently navigating your own battlefield, remember that you are far more dangerous than the people trying to break you. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you found power, validation, or strategy in this experience, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your own boundaries in the comments below. You are watching Olivia Stories Revenge, where we prove that the ultimate payback is not just surviving the storm, but owning the ground it leaves behind. Stay sharp, guard your peace, and I will see you in the next video.